Jones. He's been a regular guest on my program over perhaps the last couple of years occasionally. Dr. Jones is the editor and publisher of the Culture Wars magazine. He's the author of numerous books, including The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, which I found very interesting in that it's a great history of Catholicism and its various heresies, I found. And his latest, which is the Holocaust narrative. Michael, thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
Thank you. So I think we should start with your offering a brief synopsis of your book, The Holocaust Narrative, and then I'll comment.
Yeah, I received a PhD in American literature in 1979. And it's the one area where I feel I have some type of expertise. I've written about everything under the sun since that time, but in a sense, I'm always drawn back to literary criticism. So right now I'm doing research on American identity. And the people who created American identity. And the only way you can do research in this regard is doing literature, because these are the people that created the identity, American identity. James Fenimore Cooper is an example of what I'm talking about. Natty Bumppo is an archetypal American. He's the hero of the leather stocking tales. And you can't really understand what we are today unless you look into somebody like Natty Bumppo. So the same thing is true of the Holocaust. It's basically, it's a narrative. It came into existence at a certain period of time through literature. It's pretty much literature. And so in a sense, it's why not? Let's do a history of this narrative based on the literary pieces that created it. Okay. Indeed. And so we began, I began before that. It's not really literature. It's more or less propaganda. But when the United States Army marched across Germany in the early months of 1945, they came across concentration camps. The first concentration camp that Eisenhower came across was Ohrdruf. No one talks about Ohrdruf anymore. It's not mentioned in any of the books, and I think this is significant because it seemed to fit the paradigm. They come into the camp. There are dead bodies all over the place. Now, this is a category of reality. They were real people. They were real dead bodies. But what Eisenhower saw was an opportunity to, as he put it, to explain to the American soldier what he's fighting for. That's a direct quote. And to do that, they had to impose categories of the mind on these categories of reality. He invited congressmen, he invited journalists, he invited Patton, he invited Omar Bradley. They came there and it kind of held this situation in abeyance, which was not good. I mean, from the point of view of the bodies that were there lying on the ground, the bodies in the buildings. Patton walked right out and threw up because of the decayed bodies. But this is the situation. Okay. Now, the significant fact of the matter here is that there were no gas chambers in Ohrdruf. There were no instruments of extermination in Ohrdruf. They died. The bodies they died, but the question is, how did they die? They were not exterminated. They died, and they died from disease. And what you had was a situation in all of the camps. All of the camps shared the same situation at the end of the war. They were cut off from a food supply. They were cut off because the Allies were bombing the rail lines that allowed them to get into it. They were overcrowded, and you put these two things together and you have a recipe for epidemics. And so they died of typhus, typhoid, and all of the diseases that come about when people live too close together without proper sanitary facilities. So Ohrdruf was forgotten. Basically, it's a footnote, but it's forgotten. And so what Eisenhower did was, let's make a production out of the next camp along the road. And that was Buchenwald. And Buchenwald is near Weimar. So we're getting to a significant population center. And at this point, Eisenhower called in General McClure. General McClure was head of psychological warfare, and he said basically we're going to stage it's not quite a show trial, but we're going to stage something here. And then McClure said to his assistant C.D. Jackson to basically stage a show. Now, C.D. Jackson is one of the most important figures in the 20th century in America because he was heavily involved in psychological warfare. Which became a huge operation during the mid-20th century. He became, because of what he did in Buchenwald, he became Eisenhower's campaign manager. From there, he went on to become a member of the CIA and Time Life at the same time. Time Life was the propaganda ministry of the United States of America.
Right, Henry Luce's publication.
He was the right-hand man of Henry Luce. Okay, so he goes in, two psychological warfare officers go in, they set up a table, and on the table they put a lampshade, which is supposedly made of Jewish skin, a human pelvis, which was supposedly used as an ashtray, and two shrunken heads. And they get the mayor of Weimar to march 2,000 Germans out there to look at this. And they have Billy Wilder, the soon-to-be famous Hollywood director, the Jew, his name was Shmuel Wilder, to come and photograph this. And in one of the documentaries, he actually steps on camera so you can actually see him. And then what they did was to try and focus on the reaction of the crowd. Well, the reaction of the crowd was bewilderment. Okay, this is absolutely crazy what they did there. Is anyone seriously saying that Germans shrunk heads? This is preposterous. They got the two heads from a museum, and they were testimonies. The tribes in the Amazon shrink heads. It was obviously in a museum. And so as a result, you have, once again, a failure. The first Ohrdruf is not going to fly. And now Buchenwald is not going to fly because of the preposterous show that the psychological warfare people put on. So, but what you're seeing here is the beginning stages of the narrative. We're trying. So eventually, Billy Wilder did come up with a film, and it was called Death Mills or Todesmühlen. And it had an effect. It did have an effect because he was a skillful director and editor and put pieces together in a way that gave momentum to this narrative. Now, what I'm saying is that's pretty much the state of the art as of that particular time. We're trying to come up with a narrative that will demonize the German people because we needed to do that to exonerate the Americans from war crimes. Eisenhower at this moment was guilty of war crimes. The Americans were guilty of war crimes in general, but Eisenhower basically put hundreds of thousands of German prisoners along the Rhine, the banks of the Rhine meadow camps, and let them there to starve to death. No water, no shelter, no food, and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. It's a question of numbers. That became a crucial issue when Bach brought out the book. The Canadian Bach brought out the book in the 1990s. I was there in the 1970s. I lived directly on the Rhine. We used to meet with English friends in Rheinberg, where they had these people interred, the soldiers interred, and you could not dig up, excavate anything along the Rhine meadows because it was against the law, and you'd go to jail because they didn't want those skeletons coming up. So this is the narrative is progressing at this point, and at a certain point, it became the first testimonies. Okay, in terms of written form, were Catholic testimonies. And I'm talking specifically about a book by the name of, it was called Christus in Dachau, Christ in Dachau. And it was written by an Austrian priest by the name of Johann Lenz. Dachau was the first concentration camp. It was created in 1933. Okay, it was when I was a boy. My father's best friend would show us pictures of Dachau. because he
Right.
was involved in the liberation of Dachau. It was very similar to all the things that I've been talking about. Dead bodies all around, obviously shocking pictures and so on and so forth. It wasn't until Lentz came up with this narrative that we started to now, obviously in the book there were other things like Borowski's short story, but I'm saying the first narratives were Catholic, about the plight of Catholic priests in Dachau. Lentz was one of them. And this narrative had its own message. It wasn't the Eisenhower message. It was the Catholic message. And it was basically Lentz saying that they were being tortured by criminals who had put on SS uniforms. They had reached the point in the summer of 1942 where if it had gone on this way, they all would have died. They would have died of starvation. And they prayed. They had their own liturgical service there. There were thousands of priests, 2,000 priests, 2 bishops, their own liturgical services. And they prayed. And in August of 1942, on the Feast of the Assumption, God answered their prayer. And Himmler sent down a memo to Dachau and said, stop starving them to death. We need them to work. He said, if it had gone on 1 year farther, we all would have died. Mm-hmm. So the message here is Lentz is not going to write this book and not give you the message here. And the message is that suffering has a purpose, that God allowed us to suffer, the priests, the Catholics, to expiate the sin of godlessness, which was pandemic among the Germans, largely because of people like Nietzsche. So this was God allowed you to suffer, but God was in control of history. And after according to God's plan, it ended on August 15th, 1942. And from that point on, they started to recover. Now, that book came out in 1955. Okay. 3 years later, the Jews hijacked the narrative. And I'm talking about the book Night, which is really La Nuit by Elie Wiesel. This was 1958. Elie Wiesel did not write this book. Elie Wiesel wrote a book in Yiddish called Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world remained silent. He showed this manuscript to a man by the name of Francois Mauriac, who was a master of French prose and who basically cut the thing down from about 600 some pages to the slim book that it is now. I don't know how many pages it is. And during this time, he not only translated it into elegant French, he also eliminated certain unpleasant elements, like Elie Wiesel talking about the Jews raping German girls at this point and bragging about that. At that point, a new narrative was created. Okay. And the new narrative also had a new message. And the new message is God died at Auschwitz. That is the exact opposite. It is promotion of atheism. It's the exact opposite of the Lentz narrative. And that's the one that took off. And I have I have grandchildren who went to a Catholic school, and all of them had to read Night. None of them read Christus in Dachau. All of them had to read Night, which is basically propaganda for atheism. Now, the significant thing about Night as well is, now this is Auschwitz. Auschwitz is now the paradigmatic concentration camp. Dachau has been pushed aside. And the story is that the Jews were killed. They were murdered in flaming pits. Okay, there are no gas chambers in Night. Elie Wiesel did not talk about gas chambers at all. And so if you want to be technical about it, and you're a follower of Debbie Lipstadt, Elie Wiesel is a Holocaust denier. There are no gas chambers in Night, and we know now, obvious, that there are no flaming pits either, because the Americans and the British did reconnaissance flights over Auschwitz at this period of time, and there were no flaming pits. So basically, this is the beginning of the narrative that has continued to this day. There are over 400 Holocaust films, and the most recent one is The Zone of Interest. A Jew by the name of Jonathan Glazer was the director of the film. It's about Auschwitz. Auschwitz is not in the thing at all. All we have is the domestic life of Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant at Auschwitz. Okay, talking about what a great family man he was, or something like that. Now, this we have now reached a point of crisis, largely because of Gaza. And so when Jonathan Glazer came to give his acceptance speech at the Oscars, he stood up there and he said, we refute, I mean, the people, he and the people involved, we refute our Jewishness. This is a crisis right now that is the result of Gaza. He was obviously referring to the Israeli incursion into Gaza. And that's the crisis that is basically where things stand right now.
Okay. Well, first of all, Mike, I mean, I think that it's safe to say that in any situation where there's a war, where there's a conflict, you have propaganda on both sides. You have propaganda to try to promote or to try to de-emphasize the humanity of the enemy, while you promote and embellish the humanity of your side. That goes back to ancient times. I mean, that goes back to Roman times. And in that context, probably clearly you make the case that there was this attempt to develop a Holocaust narrative early on in the war, actually toward the end of the war. Before that, it was kind of a covered up thing by the New York Times. But putting that aside, when you're saying that there's a Holocaust narrative, are you suggesting that there was no Holocaust? Are you suggesting that the Nazi regime did not have what was devised at the Wannsee Conference, the final solution against the Jewish people? I mean, there are, I agree that there probably at the early stages were exaggerations and stagings and that sort of thing, which I think ultimately was unnecessary. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there was a Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, and it doesn't take away from the fact that I would suggest that the real narrative there actually has very little to do with ultimately with the Jews. It has to do with the fact that you can have a totalitarian regime conduct a social experiment against anyone they don't like, any enemy, and go after those people to the point where, as is the case with the Jews, every Jew is hunted down. They're not all caught, of course. And that includes men, women, and children within the region that this nation occupied, and they're sent to camps. So it was a social experiment that I think all of mankind can learn from, because it can happen again. It could happen against today. I mean, it could happen against people who refuse to take the so-called vaccine, right? There was talks about putting people in camps. It could happen against Trump supporters, right? There's talks about re-educating them because we're all in a cult. I'm saying that there's a greater narrative here that can be looked upon by everyone, and that transcends the fact that in this particular case, it was the Jews who were targeted in Germany and in occupied Europe.
Okay, Charles, you started off with what seemed like a question, and then it turned into a speech. And by the time you got to the end of the speech, I kind of lost track of what the question was. So
Okay.
if you can focus the question better, I would be better able to give an answer.
All right. I mean, I don't recall asking a question. I simply recalled agreeing with you that there's propaganda on all sides when you're crafting a narrative, but that doesn't take away from the fact that this happened. And the second point I wanted to make is about Dachau and Christ in Dachau in that particular story. There is a difference here that I think needs to be pointed out. Yes, Dachau was set up by the Nazis to detain their enemies, political enemies, and that included Catholic priests who were dissident and who were against this atheistic regime. But the difference between that and the Holocaust against the Jews is that they put in Dachau individuals who they viewed as enemies of the state, whereas in the case of the Jews, they put in everybody. That's what makes it unprecedented. They put in women, children, elderly people. Anybody who had any remnant of a Jewish background, even if you had a half Jewish background, you were susceptible to and possibly could be picked up, and in many cases were picked up. And that's what makes it unprecedented. Individuals who had Jewish background had nothing to do with whether they were religious or not, nothing to do with anything, just that they might have biologically had Jewish background, were hunted down and sent off to camp.
Okay. The Father Lentz was arrested because he was a Catholic. Catholics were arrested because they were Catholics. Jews were arrested because they were Jews. Okay. So I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that there are people who were arrested simply for what they were. Okay. Now, the question is, what was a Jew? What is a Jew?
If I could just,
but let me finish here.
But let me just interject. They were not arrested because they were Catholic. I mean, Adolf Hitler was Catholic. They were arrested because they were viewed as dissidents of the state, and that Catholicism.
They were arrested because they were Catholics. The Catholic Church was perceived as an enemy of the Third Reich because
they would have had to arrest about 30% of the German population.
Doesn't change the fact that the Catholic Church was perceived as an enemy. Obviously,
I agree, but I would argue
obviously they can't arrest every Catholic. They couldn't arrest every Jew either. They only arrested some.
No, they tried to.
They would have arrested. So if you're trying to create some type of difference here, because this group was arrested for one reason, they were both arrested for what they were, and that's undeniable.
Well, I disagree with you. I think they were arrested because they were seen as dissidents of the state. They were threats to the power of the Nazi regime.
Well, now let's stop there. Let's stop there. How were the Jews perceived at this point?
The Jews were perceived.
Let me go on here. The Jews were engaged in the subversion of the German state after World War I.
Some were. Was Anne Frank engaged in subversion of the German state? No, I mean, there were certain Jews.
Wait a minute. We are back at square one here. Okay. We have to be able to use the category known as the Jews. It's not anti-Semitic to say the Jews anymore. It's anti-Catholic to say the Catholics. So I have to use this term. And the fact of the matter was that the Jews were perceived as a subversive element. So if you're going to say the Catholics were perceived as a subversive element, because they were Catholics, the Jews were perceived as a subversive element because they were Jews. And there's a lot more evidence to make that case against the Jews than there is to make it against Catholics. The best example.
I don't think you can make that evidence against either side.
Let me finish. The best example was the Soviet Republic of Bavaria. This is where the Nazi movement got started. This is where Adolf Hitler was during the 1920s. After the First World War, Russian Jews showed up and took over the state of Bavaria. We know that because Eugenio Pacelli was the nuncio. He went to the Wittelsbach Palace at this time, and he wrote a report back to Rome, which was mistranslated by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen in one of his spurious books. And Pius XII went there and said, there are no Germans here. It's all Russian Jews who have taken over the Wittelsbach Palace. Now, this is what propelled Hitler into power. Because the Jews were perceived, and I think rightly so, as a threat to the German people because of what they did after World War I. If this hadn't happened, Hitler never could have come to power.
Well, first of all, I mean, putting aside the fact that there's always been some rumors, at least, that Hitler himself was involved in the Sovietization of Bavaria during that period of time with, I forget the guy's name, the German Jewish head of that state. The point I'm making here is that
Eugen Levine.
Okay. The point I'm making here is that the vast majority of Jews were not involved in the Sovietization of Bavaria. They were loyal Germans, and that the reason they were picked up was not because they were communists, although there certainly were Jewish communists and non-Jewish communists. And yes, the majority of them were Jewish, and that's a terrible stain on Jewish history. But putting that aside, the vast majority of Jews were not communists. They were loyal Germans.
The same thing.
And the reason they were picked up was not because they were communists, but because they were Jews.
The same thing applies to Catholics. The same argumentation applies to Catholics. And there's much
Yeah, but
more.
the Catholics were
Wait a
not
minute.
all rounded up.
Let me finish. The Jews weren't all rounded up either.
Yes, they were.
But there's much more evidence. There's much more evidence that the Jews were involved in subversive activity than you could claim to be for the Catholics. Those Catholic priests.
Some of them were, but the majority of Jews were not.
None of them.
And they were rounded up because they were Jews. No other reason. Anne Frank was not involved with subversive
The only
activity.
reason that
her father was a shoe salesman. He wasn't at all political. Most Jews were not involved, but they were rounded up because they were Jews.
Most Catholics were not involved, and they
most Catholics were not rounded up.
You're interrupting me. You're interrupting.
Anyway, Michael, I want to move on to another subject here because I want to get to the basic root of your thesis. I don't think we can leave it as the elephant in the room, and that is, and I've heard you talk about this, that the motivation that you have in your characterization here is not because some of the Jews were communists and they were involved in the Bolshevik Revolution, not because you claim that Israel is involved in genocide or anything like that. It's because you view the entire enterprise of Judaism itself and the Jewish people as subversive by nature because 2,000 years ago, the Jewish authorities, the Judean authorities, the deep state, I think, in Judea, the Herodians, recommended the crucifixion of Jesus to the Roman authorities. And therefore, because of that, we are subversives ever since. That you view us as being anti-Logos, as you've said in your book, Logos Rising, when in fact Judaism itself represents Logos. It represents the receipt of the Torah at Sinai, the rules, the laws, the ethics, the precepts of God. And it's the very essence of Logos. But because of the fact that our deep state recommended the crucifixion of Jesus, you view all Jews as anti-Logos and as part of this conspiracy, I suppose, that I would argue you've concocted.
Okay, you're talking about the thesis of the Jewish revolutionary spirit, okay, which is that the turning point in human history came when the Jewish Messiah, arrived, and the Jews had to decide whether they are going to accept him on his terms or reject him. Okay, so when the Jews, when I say the Jews, I mean the Jewish people. There's a distinction here between the Jews and all Jews. I am not saying that all Jews shouted, "Crucify him," but the Jewish people did. The Blessed Mother did not shout, "Crucify him." She had the same DNA. Saint John stood next to her. He did not shout, "Crucify him." They were part of this group of people, if you want to talk about DNA, but they were not part of the Jewish people because that was a political entity. And this political entity demanded the death of Jesus Christ to a reluctant Pontius Pilate who wanted to release him, but could not because of fear of the Jews. Now that was a momentous act. And the Jews ratified it, the Jewish people. When I say the Jews, I mean the Jewish people ratified it when they said, "His blood be on us and our children." And I'm saying that has become the Jewish identity to this day, from then to this day. The Jews are in rebellion against Logos. The Jewish people are in rebellion against Logos. When you're in rebellion against Logos, you are in rebellion against the order of the universe which God created. And that's exactly the type of people that took over the Wittelsbach Palace during the 1920s in Germany. That's the thesis. That's what I stand by.
First of all, I don't think that Judaism as a faith and the Jewish people are their own organic dynamic faith. It goes back to Sinai. It has nothing to do with Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad or anyone else. They stand on their own. It is a society. It is an ethnicity. It is a belief system based on belief in God. As far as Jesus goes, I would argue that most Jews in Judea probably had no idea even that he was of his ministry, and that the people that might have been in that crowd, who knows who they were, but the concept that any Jew would say the blood of Jesus would be on our heads, that runs against the Torah. That doesn't seem like a sound idea, because the Torah says that the sins of the father are not visited upon the next generation.
Did Matthew lie when he said that?
I think that somebody might have put that in there. Yes, I think
so. He's lying. So it's not.
Yeah.
So
I wouldn't say. I don't want to use the word lie, but I think that, put it this way: when that book was codified a century after Jesus' death, I think that there was a war between these two branches.
So it's not true. So it's not true.
Well, okay. I don't know.
Did Jesus' disciples steal his body and move it out of the tomb?
I have no idea. But as far as somebody yelling out the blood of, who did? I mean, they didn't speak for Judaism. That's against Jewish law.
No, this was the Jewish people. Now, we've been down this road before. Okay, you have this, what should I say, a fantasy that somehow there is a continuity between Moses and what is now called Judaism. There is no continuity.
It's an absolutely proven system.
There is no continuity whatsoever.
There's complete continuity.
Okay. Now let me back up here with something we've already talked about before.
Sure.
With the overturning of Roe versus Wade, 400 Jewish organizations said abortion is a fundamental Jewish value. Now, we've been through this before. Since that time, the appeals court of the state of Indiana has recognized that statement as a statement of the Jewish religion. Jews now have an exemption when it comes to abortion, because abortion is part of their religion. That is the statement of the court of Indiana. Now, I'm saying if abortion is part of your religion, you worship Moloch. You are a descendant not of Moses. You are a descendant of the people that were worshiping the golden calf when he came down from the mountain. That's your religion. It is not the religion of the Old Testament.
First of all, I did have a chance to look into this. I've heard you make this preposterous charge before. The organizations that claim that are ultra-liberal Jewish organizations. Now, yes, Judaism has been split for centuries between this liberal subversive takeover that I trace back to the advent of the false Messiah Shabtai Zvi and his disciple Jacob Frank, who, by the way, converted to Catholicism. And more conventional Orthodox Judaism, which is conventional Judaism, that is not pro-abortion. Now, the fact is that
Charles, I had hoped that we were going to have a meeting of the minds here. I mean, we did this pause. I would not debate genocide with you when you first asked me, because genocide is not a debatable topic. I had hoped that you would come to your senses. But if you're just going to just dismiss these facts as irrelevant.
You're right. I mean, these are liberal. First of all, they're liberal Jewish organizations. I looked into this. I looked into the nature of their claims. I went to some talks with liberal Jews at the time that Roe versus Wade is overturned. And yes, Judaism is a bit more liberal than Catholicism on abortion, in that we favor the life of the mother versus the life of the unborn child. That does not therefore mean, wait a minute. That does not therefore mean that we're condoning and endorsing abortion. They are not, except for some real hard left fringe.
No, it's not real hard left. The state of Indiana recognized their claim that this was part of their religion. This is the Jewish religion
as part of their religion.
Of course it does.
Ultra left-wing organizations.
No, you're talking about ultra left-wing Jewish organizations. You're constantly trying to divert our attention from the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who get to determine by majority rules that abortion is a fundamental Jewish value. You're not I've said this before, you're not the Pope, you're not Ben Shapiro, you can't excommunicate any Jew who disagrees with you.
They don't speak for me, and they don't speak for.
But they speak for the Jewish people. That's
they
been
don't.
recognized.
We don't have a pope.
I'm
We don't have
saying,
somebody that speaks
I'm
for us.
saying that the
They may
state,
claim to, and they're wrong.
I'm saying that the
Judaism
state,
does not condone abortion, period. It only, except in the case of the life of the mother.
Look, the state of Indiana has recognized the fact that this is part of the Jewish religion. Let's talk about something else. It's
Okay.
pointless. It's pointless to
It
try
is pointless, and
when
it's.
you're.
I made my
Let me
case
let
on
me
that.
just say something. Let me just say something. What has happened over this period of time is that Jews have become. The period of time from the last time we talked is that Jews have become odious to the entire world. This is exactly what St. Paul said. St. Paul said the Jews are the people who killed Christ, and they are enemies of the
Yeah,
entire human race.
Did you read
This is
Paul's letter to the Romans, number 10?
You're
Number
interrupting.
11, I mean?
You're interrupting me.
I'm sorry.
And what happened over this period of time from the attack on Gaza is that is now an empirical statement that can be verified by United Nations resolutions. The world calls for a ceasefire, and the only people who are opposing this, the United States, Israel, Micronesia, and Nauru, which you probably couldn't even identify on the map. The Jews have become odious to the entire world because they are claiming that they are above the moral law which Moses established on Sinai. That's an undeniable fact.
Above the moral law. Also, they're maybe odious to the same. They're odious to the same deep state that rejected Israel in 1948. The average American and the average person is not in accord with that. This is a small clique of Qatar-funded leftists, the same knuckleheads that went out for the Pussy Hat rallies, who are causing trouble on campuses, and the same establishment that supports them and works with them. The majority of Americans, both liberal and Democrat, both liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican, are supportive of Israel's right to defend itself against a genocidal assault.
Okay. Let's have a fact check here. Okay, what happened also in the meantime is that Representative Massey was reelected in spite of opposition by IPAC, and he said every single member of Congress has a minder.
Right.
Someone from IPAC who tells him how to vote. The United States Congress is controlled by Jews. That is an undeniable fact.
What do you think they're trying to get done exactly when you say it's controlled by Jews?
Well, the obvious thing is sending more money to Israel, more bombs, so that the Israelis can continue their genocide of the Palestinian people.
You know, they are supportive of the state of Israel and its right to exist. And the fact that you would call this a genocide tells me actually that Israel is winning. Because if the shoe was on the other foot and Israel was losing and there was a real genocide going on, like it did on October 7th, you wouldn't be talking about it. Just like you don't talk about the slow motion genocide against Christians in Africa and in Asia.
This is preposterous, Charles. You're discrediting yourself by denying reality. When you do, this is the problem with Jews, and I'm going to be honest with you. Jews never do anything wrong. Okay, they can slaughter.
They do plenty of things wrong.
Stop. They can slaughter innocent women and children in Gaza.
So you're saying Israel is deliberately and consciously killing innocent people? Is that what you're saying? Are you saying that the state of Israel and the IDF is deliberately and consciously killing innocent women and children? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Well, would you say that the United States innocently killed innocent people at Normandy? They did. Innocent people died.
Charles,
Eisenhower is sitting there.
Charles, wait a minute. Charles,
women and children over here. Let's bomb that spot.
Calm down. You're getting irrational. You're just getting irrational.
I am not.
I began my presentation.
Yeah.
I began my presentation by talking about American war crimes during World War II as the basis for the Holocaust narrative. So I'm not trying to. I'm saying that everyone
has Israel committed war crimes.
I'm saying that everyone has to be under the moral law. You have to be the moral law.
Israel is not the crisis. Nothing to explain. The crisis. Anyone else who does not wish Israel well. Israel is engaging in an urban war. It's very difficult when you have an enemy that disguises itself as civilians and hides in the homes of innocent people. Israel has gone out of their way to try to not have innocent casualties as part of this war. The question is whether or not Israel has a moral right to stop an enemy that is trying to attack it and destroy it. I would argue that they do.
Charles, this is preposterous. This is
Okay.
the evidence is all against you. I thought that we could have a
So
rational
then your
discussion.
evidence is that Israel
We don't
deliberately and
we
consciously
we are
killing
not
innocent
having
people.
we are not having a
No, I
rational
understand your
discussion.
thesis. Your claim
No,
is
no,
that
it's not.
Israel is deliberately
we are
and
not
consciously
having.
killing innocent people, and I reject that.
I know you do, and
Yeah,
so
and I
you
stand by
when
that. They are
when
not
you
doing that.
and when you reject reality, it's impossible to talk to
All
you.
right. So your
Problem
claim of
here.
reality is
Well,
Israel is
now
innocent.
you're just talking over me now. There's no
All
point
right.
in continuing with this
I just
discussion
want to make sure
if
that
you're going to
your
constantly
position
talk
is
over
clear
me.
here.
Okay, the main problem here is that Jews never apologize for doing something wrong. It's always someone else's fault. And as a result, they become odious to the entire human race, which is where they are now. So I'm trying to help you out as someone who has your best interest in mind and try to wean you away from being a propaganda instrument for a criminal regime. I'm trying to help
I
you.
think Israel,
And the
okay,
point,
thank you for
and the
the help,
point,
but no thanks. Israel has apologized for mistakes that were made in Gaza. I wonder if Hamas or Hezbollah have ever apologized for the attack on October 7th. No, they're glorifying that. And it was one of the most ugly and medieval attacks in recent memory. Now, the fact is that, again, I would claim, and we're probably running out of time here, that Israel is not deliberately and consciously killing innocent women and children.
this is
That is
preposterous.
propaganda, and
This
those
is
are lies
preposterous.
that are put out by Israel's enemies and by supporters of those enemies, like you. So, okay, you've made your position clear on that, Mike. I would, let our listeners decide if Israel's deliberately engaging in that kind of attack. They are not. They're engaging in defense against an enemy that has attacked them. What would you suggest Israel do with Hamas? And what would you suggest happen in Gaza after the war? And do you think a ceasefire would have worked? I don't, but maybe.
Look, I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm trying
Right.
to reach the human being that is somewhere inside of this propaganda machine. And I'm struggling. It's an act of charity on my part to try to struggle to reach you, to help you. Okay.
I don't need your help.
You're not, the Jews need help right now.
We do
Okay.
not need help. We have nothing to explain to anybody.
The Jews need
We
help
have a
because
right to defend our sovereignty and our nation. We have no reason to defend ourselves against an obvious enemy that seeks to annihilate us. No reason to defend that. Israel has nothing to explain. Mistakes are made in war. It's a difficult situation. The question is, how do you have peace? How do you have actual peace where the killing stops?
okay, there is a specter that is haunting Israel right now. Ehud Barak is one of the people that explained it. No Jewish kingdom has lasted longer than 80 years. We're now up to 76. The Jews are facing extinction because of their own wicked policies.
Obviously
And
not.
I'm trying to help you to back out of a situation so that you don't all end up on Masada again. Okay,
It's not
you're
so much
headed.
Masada, it's the possibility that Iran might develop a nuclear bomb that they'll drop in Tel Aviv.
Whatever it is,
Sure, that's a real
whatever it
threat.
is, you're heading toward Masada, and
We've
I'm
always
trying.
faced this enemy. That's not new. I mean, there's always been an enemy against the state of Israel, not just in the Arab and Islamic world, but amongst the international elites who have never liked Israel and have always tried, including the Jewish elite, I may add, and including even Jews in Israel, like Barak, who generally they think, oh, well, Israel is going to compromise and sell out the very heartland of its biblical country to an enemy that is made up of genocidal lunatics that want to wipe Israel out, people like Arafat. Israel has proven to be united in the face of this enemy and this threat. And they've gotten back to their biblical mission, which is to consolidate the control over the land that God promised us, hopefully to rebuild the temple at some point, and to continue their mission. So no, I don't think it's going anywhere, unless, of course, one of these enemies, like Iran, drops a bomb. There's not much that can be done with that. So you may be right. That could happen.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm disappointed. I thought we could talk. We can't talk. You're just a propaganda machine, and I can't talk with a propaganda machine.
And neither can I. You believe that the Jews are cursed. It's an old Christian idea that's been rejected by the majority of Catholics, especially since World War II. And by the way, Catholicism, you know, it's Judaism. You're a Jew, Michael. You are a branch of the Jewish faith. Look at St. Paul's letter to the Romans, number 11. Read it carefully. He talks about the fact that the Jewish people have a covenant that is forever, and that the Gentile nations are grafted in through the mission of Jesus.
Okay.
So
wait a minute. Charles, you keep talking to prevent me from talking. This is not conducive to dialogue.
Right.
So I agree with you. I've already stated this fact. I, as a Catholic, am a child of Moses. You, as a Jew, are a Moloch worshiper. That's the situation, and I agree with you.
There are Moloch worshippers both within the fold of Judaism and Catholicism.
No, Judaism is Moloch worship.
No, Judaism remains in every single day from the day of Abraham till today. You have 10 bar mitzvahed, circumcised Jewish men get together and form a minyan and pray to God. There has not been a day where the sun has gone down where that hasn't happened. We have continued
the Jewish religion, the Mosaic covenant ended when the temple was destroyed. You have no priesthood, you have no sacrifice, and the fact you yourself have admitted it because now you're trying to rebuild the temple.
Yes,
you have no way of fulfilling the Mosaic covenant.
I pray that the temple will be built.
Your religion is the worship of Moloch. It is not the religion of Moses.
We worship the Lord God, King of the universe. Blessed be he. It's the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We don't worship Moloch. The opposite. We reject paganism.
If abortion is a fundamental Jewish value, absolutely, you worship Moloch.
The Jewish religion. Hogwash.
The Jewish religion.
We view abortion as a right. Judaism does not condone abortion. It's just ridiculous. The left does, but the left of the What about Nancy Pelosi and what about Joe Biden?
Can I talk?
Are they Catholics who endorse abortion? Yes.
Can I talk?
Anyway, sure.
The main manifestations of the Jewish religion right now are slaughtering innocent women and children in Gaza and slaughtering children in the womb as a result through abortion.
I completely reject
that. Look, your rejection does not change the fact of the matter.
I think you and I both would agree. I mean, it's certainly the Catholics need to do the same thing, is that we need to take out the trash, okay? Judaism needs to cleanse its own house. It is the root and the tree upon which Christian religions have branches. As St. Paul said in the letter to the Romans, chapter 11, I urge you and your listeners to read that carefully. It makes it quite clear. And yeah, we need to take out the trash, just like you need to take out Catholics who claim that abortion is fine, like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. And the Kennedys now, not JFK and RFK, but the new generation.
It's not a question of individuals. It's a question of your religion. Your religion espouses abortion.
It
espouses genocide. It espouses pornography. The Catholic Church rejects all of these things as sins. They're virtues for a Jew. They are sins for a Catholic.
They are not virtues. They are not condoned. They're unfortunately been embraced by the left-wing side of our religion, which is dominant in many places. But it does not make the Jewish faith continues in spite of them. I've come out against that. I've come out against the ADL in that.
The Jewish faith ended when the temple was destroyed. That's
the Jewish faith will end when the third temple is built and the Messiah comes.
Well, then why are you building the third temple? Why do you need
so
it?
So that the Messiah can come.
Well, why do you need it? You said the Jewish religion continued without it. Why do you need it now?
Because we have had the miracle of 1948 and the miracle of 1967, where out of nowhere we were able to reestablish our sovereign state. That is moving the world toward the coming of the Messianic era. according to our faith.
This is
So,
you keep this up, you're going to find yourself in big trouble. You're heading toward the abyss right now. You're heading toward the
you know,
abyss, and the problem with the Jewish car is it doesn't have a reverse gear. Jews never apologize for doing anything wrong, and as a
that's
result, they plunge toward their own destruction.
we
That's
do
where you're headed.
apologize when we make
That's where you're
mistakes.
headed right now, and I'm
Mike,
trying to help you.
I want to
Every
end the
every
program. Thanks, but no
every
thanks.
time I try to help you, you shout me down.
No, thanks, but no thanks. I want to end the program with two brief Jewish jokes, if I may, to see if we can lighten the show. Jesus is standing on the top of the Mount of Olives, looking down into the city. He's looking at the gate. The Israelis send up a delegation to greet him. The Israeli delegate, the head of the delegation with his open shirt, the Israelis don't like to dress well. He's like, "Welcome to our country. Thank you for coming. We have a banquet set up for you at the King David Hotel. We have everyone's down there. They want to meet you. We've got the Pope is here. President of the United States is here. But before we go, I want to, if I may, could I ask you one quick question?" And Jesus says, "What is that?" And he says, "Is this your first visit to our country, or are you on a return visit?" You get it?
Is that it?
The other one is that there's a rabbi in New York. You're going to like this one. He gets a call from his son. The son has become Christian. He's like, "Oy vey, how could this happen? My son's become Christian. What am I going to do?" So he's in Israel, and he's at Jerusalem, and he's standing at the foot of the Temple Mount looking up, and he's praying, "Oh my God, what's happened? My son's become Christian. What am I going to do?" Suddenly everything gets quiet, and suddenly a voice comes out of heaven. And the voice says, "Tell me about it."
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Look, the days of the Borscht Belt, the days of the Borscht Belt are over. Okay. It's too serious now for joking. Anyway, that's it. You had your say. I had my say. God
Indeed.
bless you.
All right, Michael. I wish you well, and thanks so much for joining me.